quiet pine forest surrounded the hunter's cabin, isolating him from curious eyes. When he spotted a stray dog rummaging by his porch, he fired a warning shot, only to discover the worst possible truth. The stray was the prized K9 of the police chief himself. High in the mountains, where winding roads gave way to old logging trails, a single cabin stood tucked among the pines. It was the domain of William Buck Marshall, a solitary hunter who valued his privacy. Locals whispered that Buck was gruff and set in his ways, but no one could deny he knew every inch of the surrounding woodland better than anyone else in the county. One frigid morning, as dawn light filtered through the tall conifers, Buck stepped onto his porch to gather firewood. He'd just finished scanning the tree line for deer when an unexpected sound broke the stillness, a faint rustling near the cabin's side. Heart thumping. He quickly grabbed his rifle, suspecting a coyote or maybe a stray bear cub. Peering around the corner, he froze at the sight of a scruffy dog pawing at some garbage bags he'd forgotten to seal. The dog, lean and ragged, barely turned its head, acting as though it sensed no threat. Buck scowled. Stray dogs were a nuisance, especially in these remote stretches where they could harass wildlife or even carry disease. His rifle was ready, the safety off and body tense. He'd never been one to waste time. An intruder was an intruder, but just as he took aim and fired a warning shot, something flashed in the dog's eyes, a brief, almost human spark of fear. The dog scrambled backward, yelping, and that quick recoil made Buck's heart catch. He frowned, stepping closer. The bullet had only grazed the dirt, a near miss, but enough to spook the animal. Now the dog cowered, tail tucked, staring at Buck with wide, pleading eyes. It should have run, he thought. Something about its calm under fire nagged at him. Then Buck spotted a faint glint near the dog's collar, an engraved metal tag. Stray dogs didn't usually have official tags. His stomach twisted when he leaned forward for a better look. The words stamped onto the metal made his blood run cold. Property of Chief Dalton, Pine Creek PD. Camusine Ranger. Buck's grip on his rifle slackened, a cold sweat breaking across his brow. Shooting at a dog was one thing. Shooting at the police chief's dog was something else entirely. In the still hush of morning, he realized the gravity of what he'd nearly done, and it threatened to upend his solitary world in ways he never could have imagined. Buck stared in shock at the gleaming tag, heart pounding in his chest. The rifle in his hand suddenly felt like a lead weight. Panic surged. Had he actually hit the dog? He remembered the shot slicing the cold air, the dog's startled yelp, the dust kicked up by a near miss. Slowly, Buck lowered the weapon, muttering a curse at his own recklessness. The dog quivered in place, sides heaving with each breath. A trickle of fear lingered in its wide eyes, but it didn't bolt. Despite the near-fatal shot, something kept it rooted there, as if it understood that running might only provoke another round, or maybe it was too exhausted to flee. Buck swallowed hard, mind reeling with implications. Chief Dalton wasn't just some distant lawman. He ran the Pine Creek Police Department like a well-oiled machine, respected by all, even feared by those who crossed him. If word got out that Buck had nearly shot the chief's K9, it could mean deep trouble. Laws regarding harming a police dog weren't lenient, especially for an old hunter whose main companionship was the forest. Gently, Buck edged forward, rifle now held low to show no further aggression. "Easy, boy," he murmured, voice rough with guilt and uncertainty. He could see the dog trembling, its ears pinned back. The tag read, Ranger. Buck repeated the name softly, wanting to see if the dog responded. Ranger's ears flicked ever so slightly at the sound of his name. That flicker, faint as it was, sent a wave of relief through Buck. Some part of Ranger recognized his own name, recognized that maybe Buck wasn't a complete threat. Still, the dog remained crouched low, tail tucked. "How'd you end up all the way out here?" Buck wondered aloud, stepping carefully closer. He knew Pine Creek was a good 20 miles down the main road, no small distance for a lost or wandering dog. The mountains around his cabin were rugged, and venturing this far usually meant prey for bigger predators. Buck paused within a few feet of Ranger. The dog showed no sign of lunging, but those eyes still brimmed with fear. Buck swallowed. aware he was wading deeper into a mess he never wanted. "You're hungry, aren't you?" he guessed, noting the dog's gaunt ribs. "Thirsty too, I bet." It took all his courage to shift his rifle to his shoulder and kneel in the dirt. The dog stiffened but didn't move away. Slowly, Buck pulled a chunk of jerky from his vest pocket, a leftover snack from last night's hunt. He held it out, arm extended. Ranger's nose twitched, eyes flicking from Buck's face to the jerky. With a trembling step, the dog stretched forward, sniffing the air. Buck felt a pang of relief when Ranger gingerly took the morsel from his hand, chewing slowly. A hint of trust, the barest thread, formed in that exchange. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The old hunter who'd chosen isolation, the lost K9 who'd stumbled onto his property. Two beings caught between fear and survival. When Ranger finished the jerky, Buck stood, determined to do the only thing that made sense: help the dog recover, then figure out how to get him back to Chief Dalton. His cabin wasn't fancy, a small one-room structure with a lean-to for firewood, a battered porch, and a single oil lamp inside. But it had warmth, a bit of spare food, and most importantly, safety. "Come on," Buck said, gesturing for Ranger to follow. The dog hesitated, glancing at the rifle, so Buck laid it gently beside the porch steps, muzzle pointed away. "No more shots," he promised under his breath. Step by step, Ranger followed, crossing the threshold into Buck's domain. The cabin interior was dim, lit by the morning sun slanting through a narrow window. Buck set out a metal bowl, filling it with water from a jug. The dog, still jittery, approached it with caution, then lapped greedily. Once quenched, Ranger sank onto the worn rug by Buck's solitary chair, as if his legs no longer had the strength to keep him standing. Buck eased himself onto the chair, watching the dog's every move. No one else lived here, no phone lines to call the chief directly. His battered truck sat outside, and he could drive into town, but that was a 2-hour round trip on rough roads, and if Ranger was truly injured or in shock, the dog might not survive the journey without rest. A swirl of conflicting emotions pressed on Buck: guilt, fear, and a strange protective urge. He'd never wanted trouble, but trouble found him anyway. If the dog's condition worsened, or if the chief found out how close Buck had come to harm. The hunter shook his head, leaning forward to gently pat Ranger's flank. "We'll sort this out, boy," he said, soft and regretful. "Just let me do right by you now." And so, in the silent gloom of that remote mountain cabin, an unlikely bond took its first fragile root, born from a near tragedy and the hope for redemption. The hunter who chose solitude, the K9 lost and far from home, bound by a single bullet that nearly severed any chance of friendship, but perhaps also opened a door they both needed. The dog, curled on the ragged rug by the fireplace, let out a low sigh, as though the tension from outside had finally ebbed. Buck glanced at the half-empty bowl of water, noticing how greedily the animal had drunk before settling down. Now that the immediate threat had passed, he couldn't ignore the bigger issue. The tag identified the dog as Ranger, belonging to Chief Dalton of Pine Creek PD. If word got out, he'd fired at the chief's K9, even a warning shot. The consequences could be dire. Buck's gaze darted to the rifle propped against the wall, the bullet hole from the near miss still fresh in the dirt outside. His conscience prickled. "Serves me right," he muttered under his breath. "Should have checked for a collar before squeezing that trigger." He tossed another piece of jerky onto a plate, then nudged it slowly across the floor. The dog sniffed it warily, then devoured it in a few bites. Though Ranger's body trembled with fatigue, his eyes still carried a spark of keen intelligence. Buck had encountered stray dogs before. Most had a certain wild look. This Labrador, despite the rough condition of its fur, radiated training and discipline. It was a dog that once obeyed precise commands, a dog used to structure and routine. Buck almost felt a pang of respect mingling with regret. Picking up his ragged phone directory from the kitchen shelf, he flipped through it. He knew Pine Creek had a sheriff's office and a police department, and Chief Dalton was a name folks whispered about with admiration. Normally, a man like Buck avoided calling the cops, preferring solitude over entanglements. But this situation demanded immediate honesty. He had the chief's dog, and time might be crucial if the animal was lost or injured. Except Buck's old landline phone had gone dead last winter, a casualty of storm-damaged lines he never bothered to fix. He cursed softly. Driving down to Pine Creek would mean a bumpy 2-hour trek, possibly more with the winter roads still mushy from melted snow, and leaving the dog behind wasn't an option. "Guess you're coming with me," he murmured to Ranger. He stood, rummaging through the small pantry for a bit more jerky and a can of soup for himself. The dog observed him silently, head cocked. Every so often, Ranger's ears perked at the sound of a distant crow or a creak of wood in the cabin. Buck recognized the unwavering alertness. This dog was no random stray. Before setting off, Buck carefully examined Ranger for injuries. Aside from a scratch near his hind leg, likely from the wilderness trek, the dog seemed physically okay, mostly underweight and exhausted. Buck exhaled relief. He wrapped a light bandage around the dog's scratch anyway, murmuring an apology every time the dog winced. There was another concern gnawing at him. The dog's presence suggested something might be amiss with Chief Dalton. Did the chief lose his dog during a search? Had the dog run away from a crime scene? Buck pictured the chief scouring the forests for his missing canine, frantic to recover a partner who might be in danger. The dog let out a soft whine, meeting Buck's eyes with a directness that felt human-like. "Don't look at me like that," Buck muttered, flustered by the weight of responsibility. He rose abruptly. "We need to get you home." Outside, the early winter sun was sinking behind pines, casting long shadows across the clearing. Buck tried coaxing Ranger onto the passenger seat of his old pickup, but the dog hesitated. It took a few comforting words and a gentle lift to settle him onto a worn blanket. Once inside, Buck cranked the engine, which sputtered, coughed, then finally roared to life. The dog flinched at the noise, but Buck patted his shoulder. "Easy, boy. You'll be okay." The truck rumbled away from the cabin, tires crunching over gravel and ruts. Buck glanced at Ranger every so often, noticing the dog's uneasy posture. "I ain't exactly a people person," Buck said aloud, as if explaining himself, "but I'm not leaving you to fend off wolves or worse up here. We'll see if your chief's in Pine Creek, or I can call him once we get to a working phone." As they bounced along the isolated track, a band of orange stretched across the horizon, promising a cold night ahead. The dog rested his chin on the edge of the seat, eyes half-lidded, too exhausted to maintain his earlier vigilance. Buck pressed harder on the gas, anxious to beat the darkness. He knew each bend in this road by heart, yet tonight felt different. A prickling sense of worry coursed through him. He pictured the chief's reaction, anger, suspicion, maybe even legal action. Yet none of that mattered if it meant returning the dog safely. After all, Buck had come dangerously close to a fatal mistake, and in a life defined by solitude, the last thing he wanted was to live under the shadow of harming the police chief's K9. So, grim-faced and determined, Buck guided the truck deeper into the winding forest roads. The dog at his side might be the only chance to mend a possible breach of trust with the law, and maybe, just maybe, find redemption in a world he'd turned away from for too long. Night fell quickly as Buck steered his old pickup along the winding dirt roads. The beams from his headlights carved narrow tunnels through the dense pines, and the engine's rumble seemed to echo off every trunk. He glanced at Ranger, curled in the passenger seat with a worried, half-drowsy look. The dog occasionally lifted his head to peer at the swaying shadows outside. They reached a junction where the dirt path met a partially paved road, a sign that Pine Creek was still roughly an hour away. Buck's shoulders relaxed slightly. He might reach an all-night diner or a gas station with a working phone. If luck held, he could get word to Chief Dalton or someone at the police station before midnight. He spoke aloud to the dog, though the cabin of the truck was cramped and dark. "It's going to be all right," he said, as much to himself as to Ranger. "We'll explain things. You'll get back to your chief and I'll handle the fallout." The dog shifted, exhaling a low sigh. Buck felt a twinge of guilt again at how close he'd come to pulling the trigger. Half an hour later, the forest gave way to faint glimpses of civilization, a dimly lit gas station sign, a cluster of houses, and eventually a diner's neon light glowing in the distance. Buck pulled into the parking lot, truck protesting with a few squeaks of old metal. He cut the engine and turned to Ranger, patting the dog's neck. "Wait here," he said, then stopped himself. If the dog was truly the chief's K9, leaving him alone might not be wise. Someone could spot him, or the dog might bolt in confusion. "All right, come on, but stay close," he murmured, opening the passenger door. Ranger hesitated, but after Buck coaxed him, the dog hopped down. The diner was mostly empty, a lone waitress leaning on the counter. She eyed Buck's weathered clothes and the dog at his heel with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Evening," Buck greeted quietly, trying to appear calm. "Mind if I use your phone? Mine's out of service up in the mountains." The waitress shrugged. "Sure, but you gotta keep that dog calm, health code and all." Buck nodded, leading Ranger to a corner table. He dialed the Pine Creek PD's main number from the diner's clunky wall phone, heart pounding. Each ring on the other end felt like a hammer blow. Finally, a crisp female voice answered. "Pine Creek Police Department." Buck cleared his throat. This is William Marshall. I'm trying to reach Chief Dalton. It's about his K9, named Ranger." He swallowed. I found him." A brief pause. Then the woman's tone turned sharper. "Found him? The chief's dog has been missing a couple days. Where are you calling from?" Buck hastily relayed his location. "I'm at the Sunny Pines Diner off Route 54, about half an hour from Pine Creek Center." "Stay put," she said curtly. "The chief or an officer will come right away." He hung up, shoulders tense, dread and relief mixing in his gut. The dog's been missing for days, so it wasn't just an accidental stray situation. Ranger might have been searching for something, or someone. Buck sat at the table, feeling the waitress's curious gaze. Ranger settled on the floor, resting his chin on Buck's boot as if exhausted by the entire ordeal. With nothing left to do but wait, Buck rubbed the dog's ears absent-mindedly, mind spinning with questions. Why was Ranger so far from Pine Creek? Had the chief lost him in a search, or had the dog run off for reasons unknown? As the minutes dragged on, Buck kept picturing the chief's reaction. Would he be furious, or just grateful that the dog was safe? He found himself hoping for the latter, because while he dreaded contact with law enforcement for years, preferring isolation to the complexities of human entanglements, he also knew he couldn't just hide from the consequences. If returning Ranger meant facing the chief's wrath, so be it. A dog's life was worth more than Buck's pride. Time crept by. The waitress refilled his coffee, eyeing Ranger's worn collar. Buck managed a few words in thanks, but otherwise stayed quiet. Outside, the starless sky loomed, and the diner's neon sign buzzed faintly, bathing the lot in a bluish glow. Finally, headlights swept across the windows, and a police cruiser pulled up. Two figures stepped out, one in uniform, the other in plain clothes. Through the glass, Buck glimpsed a tall man with a stern expression, probably in his 50s. Even from a distance, Buck felt the authority rolling off him. That must be Chief Dalton, he thought, bracing himself. Buck's breath caught in his throat as the diner door swung open, letting in the sharp scent of the winter night air. The tall man walked in first, his expression a careful mask of authority. Behind him trailed a younger officer, scanning the room with a practiced sweep. Buck recognized the man in front immediately. Chief Dalton, the police chief of Pine Creek. His reputation preceded him, fair but firm and fiercely protective of what was his. Across the diner, the waitress froze at her station, half tempted to greet them but unsure. The few other patrons watched curiously, heads turning to see what had brought two officers out so late. Chief Dalton's gaze latched onto Ranger almost instantly. The dog perked up, ears shifting forward, tail giving a slight wag at the sight of a familiar figure. A flicker of relief broke through the chief's composed facade. He moved closer, steps cautious, his eyes scanning Ranger's condition. "Ranger," he breathed. The dog let out a soft whine and pulled away from Buck, crossing the tiled floor in a subdued but determined walk. The chief knelt, arms open, letting the dog nuzzle his chest before gently examining the scruffy fur and the bandaged scratch. "Thank God," Dalton murmured, voice cracking ever so slightly as he patted the dog. "I've been searching for you for days." Buck hovered near the booth, shoulders tight. He cleared his throat to announce his presence. "Chief, he said in a gruff tone. "I'm the one who called. William Marshall. Folks call me Buck." Dalton stood, smoothing a hand down the dog's back. He studied Buck for a moment, eyes narrowing. "You found him wandering. Where?" Buck swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. "He showed up near my cabin, up in the high country. I almost mistook him for a stray coyote or something. I didn't realize he was your dog until I saw the tag." The younger officer's gaze hardened. "You almost shot him," he repeated, voice clipped. Buck shifted from one foot to the other. "I fired a warning shot. Didn't realize he was police property. Didn't want a stray messing with my trash or wildlife. Soon as I saw the collar, I backed off." Chief Dalton exhaled slowly, looking from the dog to Buck's anxious expression. "That's quite an admission," he said, voice carrying a stern edge. Ranger pressed close to the chief's leg, as if sensing tension. The diner was hushed, no one spoke. The waitress no longer even pretending to wipe counters. Buck's throat felt dry. "Look," he said, "I ain't proud of it. I was fixing to drive him here so he could get home safe. That's the only reason I came down at this hour. I'm sorry if I caused any harm." For a moment, Dalton said nothing. Then, with a long breath, he eased up. "I appreciate that you brought him in. My men and I have been combing the forest for days after he disappeared on a training exercise. We feared the worst." He eyed the scratch on Ranger's leg and the dog's obvious exhaustion. "He's lost weight, a bit banged up, but he's alive." The younger officer seemed less willing to forgive, expression tense. "Chief, we should check the dog's injuries, file a report." Dalton nodded. "Agreed, but let's do it formally back at the station." He paused, looking Buck in the eye. "We'll have to ask you some questions, see if any laws were broken. Canine dogs are protected by state statutes." Buck stiffened, accepting the reality. He'd half expected this confrontation. "Understood. I'll cooperate. I just want you to know it was a mistake. I'd never intentionally kill a police dog." The chief's gaze lingered on Buck's rough attire, the fatigue lines around his eyes. "All right," he said more gently. "For now, let's get Ranger checked by a vet. We can handle the rest later." Buck offered a reluctant nod. The prospect of facing a potential charge was unnerving, but he couldn't blame them. He was the one who nearly pulled the trigger. At least the dog was alive, and that truth steadied him more than any fear of legal trouble. As they prepared to leave, the waitress finally approached with a forced smile, as if to diffuse the lingering tension. "Coffee to go, on the house," she offered quietly. The chief, eyes still on Ranger, shook his head. "We're fine, thank you." Then he stepped aside, letting Buck gather his coat and follow them out. In the parking lot, the cold air bit into Buck's skin. The police cruiser's headlights cast stark shadows on the asphalt. Ranger hopped in the back seat without hesitation, a mixture of relief and uncertainty flickering in his tired eyes. Dalton gave Buck a measured look. "We'll talk at the station," he said quietly. Buck nodded, cheeks flushing. His old pickup stood nearby, silent witness to the night's events. As the cruiser pulled away, he climbed into his truck, exhaling a shaky breath. He didn't know what awaited him in Pine Creek, a scolding, a fine, or worse. But he clung to one fact: the dog was safe. And if there was any way to make amends, Buck would do it, even if it meant stepping out of his solitary world and answering to the law he'd so carefully avoided. Buck's heart hammered as he followed the police cruiser down the winding road to Pine Creek. He kept a steady distance behind them, old truck rattling over potholes. Each mile felt like a step toward the unknown. The dog was safe in the back seat of that cruiser, but Buck wasn't sure if he'd be walking out of the station a free man once the chief heard the full story. By the time they reached the small police station, an unassuming brick building on the edge of Pine Creek's downtown, the sky had morphed from inky black to the faintest hint of dawn. Pale light brushed the tops of pine trees, and the crisp air smelled of coming snow. The station's front lot was mostly empty, just a few police vehicles parked with engines idling. Exhausted, Buck parked his pickup in a visitor slot and climbed out, shoulders tense. Chief Dalton opened the cruiser's back door and gently coaxed Ranger out, mindful of the dog's shaky legs. Buck stood off to the side, feeling a pang of guilt. He watched the dog sniff the air, gaze flicking momentarily to Buck, then returning to Dalton's side. "How you two had come with me," the chief said. gesturing Buck and the younger officer inside. The station was warm, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Buck took in the worn linoleum floors, a front desk with a half-asleep dispatcher, and a hallway lined with framed photos of past officers. One of the pictures caught his eye. Dalton himself standing tall with Ranger by his side, both looking confident and proud. The dog seemed healthier in that photo, fur glossy, posture strong. "Wait here," Dalton said, leading Ranger down another corridor marked K9 Veterinary. The younger officer remained with Buck, arms crossed. Neither spoke, tension simmering. In the silence, Buck wrestled with regrets. He imagined all the ways this might unfold. Dalton discovering he'd nearly shot Ranger, pressing charges for assault on a police dog, or maybe, if luck held, showing leniency in light of Buck's honest efforts to return him. But the fear of prosecution loomed large. After a few minutes, Dalton returned alone, jacket off, tie loosened. "Vet's checking him now," he said quietly. "He's dehydrated, lost some weight, but the doc thinks he'll recover." Relief fluttered in Buck's chest. "That's good." Dalton gestured to a small interview room. "Let's talk." Buck nodded, trudging inside. The younger officer hovered at the door, arms still folded. Dalton sat behind a simple wooden table, beckoning Buck to take a seat opposite him. "I want your account of how you found Ranger," Dalton said, voice controlled but with an undercurrent of tension. "Don't leave out details," Buck swallowed. "He showed up near my cabin. I fired a warning shot because I thought he was a stray. Realized my mistake as soon as I saw his collar." He paused, glancing at his rough hands. "I felt awful. So I gave him water, some food, decided to drive him down here." Dalton's jaw tightened. "Why not call us immediately from your cabin? My landline's been dead a while, and cell service is non-existent up there." It was late, and he looked tired, so I tried to help him first. The chief stared, eyes narrowing. "We've been searching the forest after he went missing during a training session. He must have gotten spooked by thunder, run off deeper than expected. Did you see any signs of an injury beyond his thinness?" Buck shook his head, voice quiet. "No, a scratch on his leg, but that's it. I bandaged it." He seemed exhausted more than wounded. Dalton exhaled. "All right. As far as the near shooting goes, you claim it was a warning shot?" Buck nodded. "Yes, sir. Didn't actually aim at him. The bullet hit the ground near his paws." The chief's gaze flicked to the younger officer, who stood watch. The man didn't interject, just gave a subtle nod, like acknowledging at least no bullet wound was found on the dog. Dalton looked back to Buck, relief tempered by lingering tension. "Consider yourself lucky the dog wasn't harmed. You understand that injuring a canine can lead to felony charges?" Buck's gut twisted. "I do. I'm truly sorry." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Dalton leaned back in his chair, sighing. "Given the circumstances, and that you brought him here, I won't press criminal charges. But you owe me and Ranger an explanation in writing for the record, plus a statement about how you found him. My department may follow up if anything changes." Disbelief and gratitude warred in Buck's heart. "Thank you. I'll do whatever you need." Dalton nodded. "Let's finish the paperwork. Then you can see Ranger for a moment, if you like. I suspect he recognizes you helped him in the end." Buck's chest loosened. A sense of unexpected grace wrapped around him. Maybe this wouldn't unravel his life after all. With a small nod, he began to detail everything. The time of day, the shot in the dirt, the dog's condition, how he decided to make that long drive despite the late hour. And through it all, one question lingered. What happens next? Once a wounded canine and a lone hunter cross paths so fatefully. Buck had no clue. But for the first time, he felt a twinge of connection to something beyond his solitary cabin, and that might be the start of an unforeseen chapter in both his life and Ranger's. After signing his statement, Buck found himself standing in a short hallway outside the makeshift veterinary room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a faint antiseptic smell wafted through the air. He felt oddly vulnerable without his rifle slung over his shoulder. Here, in the domain of law enforcement, he was just another citizen, someone who'd nearly made a grave mistake. Chief Dalton emerged, wiping his hands on a paper towel. "Vet says Ranger's stable," he reported, meeting Buck's gaze. "He's hooked up to an IV for fluids, getting some vitamins. We expect a full recovery." Relief flickered across his features, quickly masked by professional composure. "You can see him if you like." Buck hesitated, uncertain if he had the right to approach the dog after everything that happened. But something about Dalton's steady look told him it was okay. Nodding, Buck followed the chief into the small room. His stomach knotted at the sight. Ranger lying on a padded mat, IV line taped to his foreleg, eyes half closed. The dog's tail gave a weak thump as they approached, a semblance of recognition. Quietly, Buck eased down on one knee beside the mat. "Hey, boy," he murmured. The dog blinked, muzzle twitching as though trying to pick up Buck's scent. A pang of guilt stabbed through him. "Didn't mean to scare you, or nearly, you know." Dalton, arms folded, watched from the doorway, features softened by concern for his partner. "He's been missing for days," the chief explained. "Wandered off during a training session. Some sudden noise spooked him, and by the time we tracked him, a storm had erased his trail. We put out bulletins, searched high and low." He paused, eyes dropping to Ranger's bandaged paw. "Guess he ended up at your cabin, half-starved and lost, if you hadn't found him." He trailed off, voice tight with unspoken fears. Buck gave a short nod, gently patting Ranger's flank. "I'm sorry it took a warning shot to realize he was special." The dog licked Buck's hand, a subtle gesture of trust. It stunned him. He expected the dog to cower or growl, not show forgiveness. The acceptance weighed on him like a lesson in humility. He stroked the Labrador's ear, feeling his breath hitch. Dalton's voice broke the moment. "Ranger's a canine we're proud of. He's helped solve cases, locate missing hikers, always loyal. This setback won't keep him down for long if I know him." A faint, proud smile touched his lips. Buck rose, clearing his throat. I appreciate you not pressing charges. Could have gone differently if he'd been hurt." The chief nodded. "It still might if my superiors insist on an investigation, but I'll testify you acted on a mistaken assumption and then did the right thing." He regarded Buck for a long moment, reading the lines of remorse etched into the man's weathered face. "I've heard about you, Marshal. You keep to yourself up there in the mountains. Good tracker, good shot. Folks respect that, but you know, living in isolation can cloud your judgment about what's a threat and what's not." Buck looked away, heat creeping into his cheeks. "Maybe so. Didn't see much point in socializing." Dalton gestured at the dog. "Rangers taught me plenty about the importance of community, trusting others, working alone. You can miss a lot of signals." The remark stung, but it rang true. Buck's entire life had been built around the idea that solitude was safer. He'd drifted from family, never married, and found companionship only in the forest. Then a single stray bullet nearly shattered someone else's world, someone who was simply lost and in need of help. He offered a short, stiff nod. "I'll keep that in mind." Turning back to Ranger, he let his hand linger on the dog's side. "Look, if there's anything I can do to make amends." Dalton's expression softened. "Just keep an eye on our communications. We may need a formal statement if the department investigates. In the meantime, once Ranger's fit, I'd like you to come see him. Might be good for you both." Buck blinked, taken aback by the invitation. "You want me to come by?" "Ranger recognized you helped him," the chief replied simply. "And maybe you could use a reminder that we're not out to get you. Pine Creek is a community, not an enemy." A strange warmth flickered in Buck's chest, conflicting with his ingrained habits of solitude. Still, he found himself nodding. "Sure. I guess I owe him a visit at least." Dalton gave a small, satisfied nod. With that, Buck placed a final gentle pat on Ranger's fur, then stepped back. The dog made a faint sound, almost like a sigh of contentment, as if acknowledging their odd bond. Outside the station, the sky had brightened to a pale morning hue, welcoming him back to the real world he'd so long avoided. Buck inhaled the crisp air, realizing something had shifted in him. Perhaps it was guilt or gratitude, or a bit of both. But one thing was certain, his life was no longer just the lonely hush of the pines. Now, it carried the echo of a near-disaster turned second chance say, shared between a weathered hunter and a brave K9 who taught him there was more than survival out in those woods. Buck left Pine Creek's small police station well into the morning, exhaustion weighing on his limbs. He climbed into his rattling pickup, fired the engine, and pulled away, the streets of the quiet town unfolding under early light. Everything felt slightly surreal. Just hours before, he'd been holed up in his mountain cabin, convinced solitude was safety. Now, he was driving home after an encounter that might redefine his relationship with the town he usually avoided. The trip back took longer than usual, mostly because Buck kept replaying the chief's words in his head. The idea that Ranger had recognized Buck's help, that the dog might want to see him again, unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. He'd lived so long trusting only himself and the forest's rhythms, yet here he was drawn into a connection with a canine he'd nearly shot. When the cabin finally appeared, squatting among tall pines, he parked and killed the engine, letting the sudden silence wash over him. Stepping out, he noticed fresh footprints of deer near the porch, a sign that wildlife had ventured close in his absence. Before, that might have pleased him. But today his mind fixated on how quickly he'd pulled the trigger when he'd mistaken a dog for a stray predator. A chill crawled up his spine at the memory of that near-fatal shot. Dragging himself inside, he slumped onto a creaky wooden chair by the cold hearth. The cabin felt emptier than usual. Once, that emptiness was comforting. No visitors, no interference. Now, it weighed on him, reminding him that the only reason he'd left was to save a dog that shouldn't have been in this predicament in the first place. For a while, he sat in a haze, the events of the night swirling. Eventually, hunger pulled him to the kitchen. He heated a can of stew over the fire, chewing absent-mindedly. Each bite reminded him of how Ranger had devoured the jerky. The memory of those pleading canine eyes stung with guilt. "Why'd you run so far, boy?" he wondered. "What were you searching for?" Days slid by in a blur of routine. Buck chopped wood, hunted small game, tidied the cabin. He tried to push thoughts of Ranger aside, but every once in a while, the memory jabbed him. The softness in the dog's gaze, the relief in Chief Dalton's voice. Despite Buck's old aversion to social contact, he found himself restlessly checking the landline he'd never bothered to repair, as though half expecting it to ring. It never did. Finally, near the week's end, a dusty county truck rumbled up to the cabin. Buck stepped outside, rifle slung loosely, only to see the younger officer from Pine Creek Station climbing out. A wave of alarm surged. Maybe the investigation changed course, he thought. Maybe they're here to arrest me after all. But the officer offered a brief nod. No hostility in his expression. "Buck Marshall," he called. "Yeah, that's me," Buck replied, forcing calm into his voice. The officer drew close, hands resting on his belt. "Chief Dalton wanted me to let you know Ranger's on the mend. We're taking him home tomorrow. Thought you'd like an update." He paused, shifting awkwardly. "Also," the chief said, "if you wanted to come by, you're welcome." A strange mixture of relief and unease tangled in Buck's chest. "Is that so? He's not pressing charges, then?" The officer shrugged. "Doesn't look like it. You cooperated fully, and Ranger's not harmed beyond some weight loss and a scratch. Still, the chief wants a final chat. Something about possible restitution. He's big on folks making amends in a more constructive way." Buck blew out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The thought of seeing Ranger again, or stepping foot in that police station a second time, felt daunting, but he heard himself say, "All right, I'll come down." A flicker of a smile crossed the officer's face. He tipped his hat. "See you in Pine Creek, then." With that, he drove off, leaving a swirl of dust in his wake. Buck stared after him, a knot of tension and curiosity churning in his gut. Slowly, he returned to the porch, setting his rifle against the railing. The forest felt different now, less a fortress, more a lonely perimeter. The dog's presence had pierced that barrier, if only briefly. Early the next morning, Buck washed up, donned cleaner clothes, and drove back toward Pine Creek. The roads felt familiar, yet strangely new. When he arrived at the station, an officer directed him to a small side yard behind the building. There, he found Chief Dalton kneeling by Ranger, who lay on a soft blanket, tail thumping at Dalton's gentle touch. At the sight of Buck, Ranger's ears perked. The dog lifted his head, letting out a low, tentative whine, nothing like fear or pain, but rather a recognition. Buck swallowed hard, stepping closer, overshadowed by guilt and something else. Hope, maybe. Dalton gave him a nod. "He's doing better," the chief said. "Still needs rest, but he's going home with me soon. Care to say hi?" Buck crouched, feeling the dog's nose sniff his hand. Then Ranger licked his palm softly, as if absolving him of the near-fatal mistake. A lump rose in Buck's throat. He glanced up, meeting Dalton's eyes. The chief's gaze was steady. "Let's talk about that restitution," Dalton said gently. And for the first time in a long while, Buck felt like he might actually belong to a community, not just the Silent Pines. If he chose to step forward and claim it. Buck nodded, heart thumping as Chief Dalton led him into a side office within the station. A modest room with a desk, a few chairs, and a bulletin board papered with community alerts. Ranger padded behind them, tail swishing gently, as if he, too, was part of the conversation. The dog's calm presence eased some of Buck's apprehension, though he still felt oddly out of place in a police facility. Dalton settled into the chair behind the desk, gesturing for Buck to take a seat opposite. Ranger lay at the chief's feet, exhaling a soft huff of contentment. "First, let me thank you," Dalton began, voice measured. "You took responsibility, brought Ranger in, and ensured he got the care he needed. I know the circumstances were tense and—" Buck held up a hand, throat tight. "I'm the one who should be thanking you for not pressing charges." That bullet could have hurt him. He swallowed hard. "I was too quick on the draw. If I'd recognized him sooner." Dalton studied Buck for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "We all make mistakes, but your honesty counts for something. And Ranger's going to be fine. He just needs time to gain weight, rest, and recover his training edge." He rested an elbow on the desk, hands folded. "However, we can't ignore that you nearly discharged a firearm against a K-9 officer, even if inadvertently." Buck's jaw tensed. "I get it," he said quietly, bracing for the worst. Perhaps a fine, mandatory classes, or something else that might disrupt his reclusive life. But Dalton's expression softened. "I've been thinking about an alternative," he said, "something that benefits the community and honors the role dogs play in it. We have a small volunteer program for search and rescue support, civilians who know the terrain. You have a reputation for navigating the backcountry better than most. If you'd be willing, I'd like you to join that volunteer team." Surprise washed over Buck's face. "You want me to help? With the police?" Dalton shrugged. "This county's big, and we rely on local experts for missing person cases. You'd be an asset." A small, wry smile flickered. "Call it restitution, if you like. Contribute your skills rather than pay a fine or face more serious repercussions." The notion of working with law enforcement rattled Buck. He'd spent years retreating from human contact. Yet something in Dalton's tone, respectful, straightforward, hinted at a real opportunity, not just punishment. And the memory of Ranger's trusting lick on his palm felt like a reminder that connecting with others might not be the nightmare he once believed. Buck cleared his throat. "I've never done official rescue work." Dalton spread his hands. "We'll train you on the basics, but your experience with wildlife tracking is exactly what we need. You'd report in if we have a call for missing hikers, runaways, or even local kids who wander off. No daily duties, just readiness when needed. And it'd help you remain in good standing with the department." A silent beat passed. Ranger lifted his head, glancing from one man to the other, as though sensing the weight of the conversation. Buck exhaled slowly, feeling a warmth stir in his chest. Maybe fate had led him here, forging a path where his solitude and skill could do more than just isolate him. "All right," he murmured, meeting Dalton's gaze. "I'll do it. It's the least I can do." A half smile curved the chief's lips. "Welcome aboard, then. We'll handle the details, paperwork, a brief orientation. Thank you for being open to this." Buck nodded, relief and nerves swirling. He looked down at Ranger, who regarded him with those wise, brown eyes. "You'll be okay, boy?" he asked softly, as though the dog might answer. Ranger responded with a slow wag, muzzle relaxing in contentment. Dalton stood, extending a hand across the desk. Buck shook it, the moment feeling like a formal acceptance of a new chapter in both their lives. "We'll keep in touch," the chief said. "In the meantime, get some rest. We'll let you know when Ranger's fully recovered too." Buck rose, joints creaking, mind whirling. "I appreciate it, more than I can say." Outside, the early afternoon sun cast crisp winter shadows. Buck paused by his truck, glancing back at the station doors. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to flee from the town center. He slid into the driver's seat, letting the old engine rumble to life, the prospect of returning to his cabin tempered by the knowledge that he was no longer so isolated. As he drove off, he imagined his future, occasionally answering a call from Pine Creek PD, stepping out of his self-imposed exile to help someone lost in the mountains. All because one dog, owned by the police chief, had strayed into his world and forced him to face not just a near tragedy, but the possibility of change. In that silent thought, Buck found a stirring of hope. Maybe the forest wasn't the only home he had. Maybe he had a place among people too, if he dared to accept it. Over the next few weeks, Buck settled into a strange new routine. He still spent most of his time in his mountainside cabin, hunting and chopping wood like always, but every so often he'd drive into Pine Creek. At first, it was just to sign papers and complete the volunteer orientation. Then, unexpectedly, the police chief started inviting him by the station for coffee, where they'd briefly chat about weather patterns, game sightings, or how best to navigate the rough backcountry. It felt odd. Buck had avoided small talk for years, yet there was a certain comfort in these simple interactions. The station staff, once wary at the story of a hermit hunter nearly shooting a K9, gradually warmed to him. The younger officer who had glared so harshly that first night now offered curt nods of approval. And Chief Dalton, he seemed quietly pleased that Buck was stepping outside his solitude. Sometimes, Ranger would be there, tail wagging lazily in greeting, nearly recovered from his ordeal. The dog's ribs no longer showed, and his coat glowed with renewed health. Each time Buck saw him, a sense of gratitude bloomed. They'd both dodged a bullet in more ways than one. Meanwhile, the volunteer rescue program kicked off. The county's broad terrain needed guides who knew the hidden paths, weather shifts, and dangers. Buck proved invaluable right away. His first assignment came on a brisk morning, a frantic call about 2 teenagers who'd wandered off the main hiking trail after a dare. When the dispatch requested volunteers, Buck felt that old tension tighten in his chest. Did he really want to be around more people? Get involved in a rescue? But memory of Ranger's trusting gaze nudged him on. He grabbed his gear, compass, rope, extra blankets, and drove down to Pine Creek, meeting the small search team. As they organized, Chief Dalton nodded in relief at Buck's arrival. "We could use your expertise in those northern ridges," Dalton said, pointing to a map. "Think you can guide a couple of our guys there?" Buck swallowed, forcing down the nerves. "Sure," he murmured, studying the map. He let his finger trace a narrow ridge that dipped into a valley. If they went off trail, that's likely where they'd end up. Armed with a radio, Buck led 2 young officers up the mountain. He moved with practiced ease, scanning for footprints, broken branches, or hints of passage. The officers, though polite, struggled to keep his pace on the steep inclines. After nearly 3 hours, Buck spotted fresh tracks near a creek bed, 2 sets of boot prints meandering off into dense pines. Motioning the officers to follow silently, he advanced. Sure enough, they found the 2 teenagers, disoriented, cold, and huddled against a tree. They startled at the sight of strangers, until Buck calmly announced they were the rescue team. Relief and tears poured from the teens. One boy had twisted his ankle, the other was shivering uncontrollably. The officers provided first aid, while Buck wrapped an extra blanket around the worst-off teen, guiding them slowly back toward the road. Despite the exhaustion, a subtle sense of triumph flickered in Buck's chest. He'd helped someone, maybe even saved them from a freezing night in the wild. Word of the successful rescue spread around Pine Creek. People who had only heard rumors of the reclusive hunter who nearly shot the chief's dog now whispered different stories of a man whose tracking skills saved 2 kids. Buck felt uneasy with the newfound attention, but also a quiet satisfaction. Perhaps more surprising, he felt a sense of belonging, something he hadn't felt in years. At the station a few days later, Buck arrived to complete the rescue report. Ranger bounded over, tail brushing the desk in greeting. Buck crouched to ruffle the Labrador's ears, noticing the dog's bright eyes and wagging tail. "You're looking good, buddy," he said softly. Chief Dalton, watching from a few feet away, gave a wry smile. "He's back to full form," Dalton remarked. "We might resume training next week. Could use a handler who knows these mountains." He trailed off, raising an eyebrow at Buck, half in jest, half serious. Buck half laughed, half choked. "Me? So I'm no police officer." "True," the chief said gently, "but a volunteer canine trainer could be beneficial. Ranger seems to like you." Buck blinked, startled by the idea. He rubbed the back of his neck, uncertain. "I don't know, I'm no expert." Dalton shrugged. "No pressure, just a thought. You've got a knack for reading animals and landscapes. Ranger wouldn't mind an extra friend on those training runs." For a moment, Buck let the notion linger. The cabin still called to him, the forest a sanctuary. But he couldn't deny that bridging his solitary life with the community's needs sparked something new, a sense of purpose. "Maybe I'll give it a try," he said quietly, offering the dog one last pat. Ranger leaned into him, content. And in that simple exchange, the path of Buck's future emerged a bit clearer, a path built on second chances, uneasy alliances, and the unwavering bond of a police dog who, by straying into Buck's yard, had transformed more than just a broken fence or a bullet in the ground. By late spring, the once reclusive Buck had become a near regular at Pine Creek's police station. Though he never fully lost his quiet demeanor, people warmed to his steady presence. He'd pop in for a quick briefing on search and rescue updates or to join a volunteer training session. On the days Chief Dalton set aside for Ranger's reconditioning, Buck often tagged along, learning police canine commands, helping the dog navigate mock obstacles and track practice scents. At first, Buck felt awkward, surrounded by uniformed officers half his age, but Ranger's calm acceptance made him feel less like an outsider. The dog would nose Buck's hand, tail wagging in silent approval, and in those moments, Buck glimpsed a new chapter of life that went beyond haunting the mountain trails alone. One afternoon, they tested Ranger's tracking instincts in a stretch of woods behind the station. The chief asked Buck to hide a small bag laced with a strong scent. Then, from a different start point, Ranger was tasked with finding it. Buck concealed the bag under a fallen log, miles from the station, brushing away footprints with a pine branch. The dog's job seemed formidable, and Buck, half certain the dog might fail, waited with a mix of curiosity and concern. An hour later, Chief Dalton and Ranger emerged from the thicket. The dog trotted straight to the log, sniffing the ground, then wagged his tail, muzzle pointing at the hidden bag. Dalton let out a short laugh, patting Ranger's flank. "Good boy." Buck, standing off to the side, felt a thrill of admiration. "He never quits," Dalton said, turning to Buck with a nod. "You placed that bag well, but Ranger still pinned it down. You see why I can't let him retire yet." Buck scratched his beard. "He's got a gift," he admitted. "I guess that near miss with me didn't break his spirit." Dalton's expression sobered. "He's resilient, but it helps that you've taken accountability. Animals sense sincerity. If you were still skittish or hostile, Ranger would know." As time passed, the tension from their rocky start began to fade. People around Pine Creek heard how Buck had become an asset in search calls, particularly where tricky terrain was involved. The same rumors that once portrayed him as a gruff recluse who nearly shot a police dog shifted to tales of redemption. The loner who found purpose aiding the department's K9 team. One evening after a lengthy training session, Buck strolled with Dalton and Ranger through Pine Creek's quiet downtown. The shops had closed, the streets were lit by old-fashioned lampposts, and a faint hush lay over the sidewalks. They stopped at a small cafe that stayed open late, pulling up seats at an outdoor table. Ranger lay at Buck's feet, panting softly from the day's exertion. Dalton sipped his coffee, eyes thoughtful. "You've changed, you know," he observed. "When we first met, you barely looked me in the eye." Buck shrugged, staring into his own mug. "Didn't have much reason to trust anyone or be around people." He reached down to pat Ranger's head, the dog's ears flicking contentedly. "Guess everything's different now, hard to explain." Dalton smiled. "Sometimes all it takes is a bit of empathy, from a dog, from a community. and we find a place we didn't realize we were missing. They lapsed into a companionable silence, the night air drifting cool around them. Buck found himself remembering the day he'd raised his rifle at the unsuspecting dog, the bullet sending dust into the air. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, instead of regrets, he felt gratitude swirling in his chest. A single mistake had led to an unexpected alliance, and a bond that reintroduced him to the world he'd once spurned. When they finished, Dalton stood, clapping Buck gently on the shoulder. "By the way," he said quietly, "the station's awarding you a special commendation next week for your volunteer work. I know you don't like attention, but it's our way of saying thanks for stepping up." Heat rose in Buck's cheeks. "I'm just doing my part. Nothing heroic." Ranger nudged Buck's leg as though disagreeing. Dalton chuckled. Sometimes the simplest acts of duty turn heroic in someone else's eyes. They parted ways at the station, Buck returning to his old truck and Dalton guiding Ranger into the cruiser. For a moment, Buck watched them go, feeling that strange, soft pang again. The solitude of his cabin still awaited him, but it was no longer a fortress. Pine Creek had become a second home, however tentative, anchored by one dog's unwavering trust. As he drove up the mountain road, headlights slicing through pine shadows, Buck let the weight of that realization settle. He'd begun this journey with a near tragedy. Now he carried not guilt alone, but a sense of belonging. And at the center of it was Ranger, once lost and nearly shot, now a partner in forging Buck's new path toward connection, redemption, and maybe even friendship he never knew he needed. A day before the commendation ceremony, Buck found himself cleaning out a corner of his cabin he'd seldom touched. An old chest mass covered in dust, stored memories he hadn't revisited in years. He wasn't sure what drove him to do it. Perhaps the subtle shift in his life, the bridging of solitude and community, urged him to shed some of the baggage he'd kept locked away. Inside the chest, he discovered faded photos of himself as a younger man, smiling next to people he once considered friends. There was a shot of him kneeling with a German Shepherd pup, a dog he'd owned long ago but lost to illness. The memory stung. He'd retreated from human bonds after that, letting the wilderness become his only companion. Now, ironically, another dog, a police canine, had nudged him back into society. Life's circular nature felt profound. Shaking off the nostalgia, Buck stepped outside. The morning air carried the aroma of pine and damp earth, the forest quietly humming with promise. He inhaled deeply. Then, deciding not to linger in old regrets, he started up his truck and headed down the mountain toward Pine Creek. He wanted to talk to Chief Dalton about the upcoming event, maybe ask if there was a small way he could express his gratitude for Ranger. He arrived at the station to find Ranger already out in the parking lot, trotting through a basic agility course set up with orange cones and short hurdles. One of the younger officers guided him with hand signals, and Ranger bounded neatly over each barrier, eyes shining. Spotting Buck, the dog's ears perked, tail thumping the air. Chief Dalton emerged from the station, a grin lighting his face at Buck's approach. "You're early," he called. "Everything all right?" Buck nodded, mouth quirking in a half smile. "Yeah, just wanted to see if I could help with anything." He glanced at the course. "Ranger looks better than ever." Dalton patted the dog's flank as Ranger padded over to them, happily sniffing Buck's boots. "He's in top shape," the chief agreed. "He'll be back on duty soon, but I'll keep letting you two practice. I think Ranger enjoys the extra familiarity." Buck crouched, running a hand along Ranger's back. The dog pressed into him, warm acceptance in every nudge. I also wanted to ask about tomorrow," Buck ventured, clearing his throat. "This commendation thing, do I need to dress up or give a speech?" Dalton laughed. "Relax, it's informal. Just a small gathering at the town hall to acknowledge your volunteer service. You'll get a certificate, maybe a handshake from the mayor. No big speeches required, unless you want to say something." Relief washed over Buck. Public speeches were nowhere on his list of favorite things. He'd do it if he had to, but the idea still made his hands sweat. "Good. I'd rather keep it low-key." As they chatted, the younger officer signaled for Ranger to resume the course. The dog sprang away, weaving among cones in a fluid motion. Buck watched with silent admiration, recalling that day in his clearing, the muzzle of his rifle, the bullet's near miss. A flicker of shame rose, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on how far they'd come. "Mind if I ask," he said softly to Dalton, "why you're so forgiving about what happened?" The chief's expression grew pensive. "It could have ended differently, but you righted your mistake immediately, took responsibility, and saved Ranger's life by bringing him in. If you'd truly been cruel or malicious, you'd have left him to starve or worse." He offered a small shrug. "We all make errors in split-second decisions. How we handle the aftermath shows who we really are." Buck swallowed the gratitude that lodged in his throat. He'd never expected compassion from a man like Dalton, whose K9 he nearly harmed. Yet here they were, forging an unlikely respect that had guided them both toward a better outcome. When the training session ended, Ranger trotted back, panting happily. Dalton clapped Buck on the shoulder. "We're wrapping up. Go get some rest. Tomorrow's ceremony starts around 10. Wear whatever you're comfortable in." Buck nodded, smiling in his subdued way. He ruffled Ranger's ears in farewell, then headed to his truck. As he drove away, the sunlight flickered through the pine branches, painting moving shadows across the dusty road. His mind drifted to the ceremony, the moment he'd stand before a few townspeople, receiving acknowledgement he never sought. Yet the thought no longer terrified him. In fact, part of him almost looked forward to it, a testament to the strange transformation sparked by one near disaster and one courageous dog. Reaching his cabin at dusk, Buck hauled in fresh wood, fixed a simple meal, and sat on the porch, letting the forest's nocturnal murmurs lull him. The rifle he once clung to for every sense of security now rested inside, untouched. Because, in his heart, something else provided reassurance: the acceptance of a police chief and his remarkable K9, forging a bridge between Buck's solitary ways and a community that had, against all odds, welcomed him back. The next morning, sunlight broke over Pine Creek in soft, golden rays, giving the small town a gentle glow. Buck drove in early, wearing a fresh plaid shirt that felt almost too new for his usual rugged style. His stomach twisted with faint nerves. He'd never liked public attention. Still, a promise was a promise. Town Hall, a modest brick building with a small clock tower, had a handful of people milling around outside. A simple banner reading "Volunteer Recognition Day" hung above the entrance. Buck felt a slight flush creep up his neck at the sight. He'd only expected a quiet handshake and a piece of paper, perhaps a dozen folks at most. But clearly, Pine Creek took these events seriously. He parked the old truck and stepped out, inhaling the crisp air. The hush of early morning gave way to chatter as more attendees trickled in. Among them, uniformed officers, some with K9 patches on their sleeves, exchanged greetings. Buck noticed the younger officer from before, who gave him a polite nod. Buck returned it, the memory of tension between them now replaced by mutual respect. Morning light bathed Pine Creek in a gentle gold, as Buck guided his battered truck into the town's modest main street. For once, his heartbeat felt oddly calm, not tight with dread or anticipation of trouble. He was here for the commendation ceremony, a small gathering to honor volunteers like him who had helped the police, especially in search and rescue missions, but this was more than a routine event. It was the day Buck, once the hermit who nearly shot the chief's dog, would stand publicly recognized for bridging a gap he never thought he'd cross. Parking near the town hall, he noticed a cluster of people heading inside, families, a few officers, even local shop owners. They greeted him with friendly nods, no longer suspicious glances. It still felt surreal. Buck forced a half smile in return, stepping through the hall's double doors. Inside, the space was simple yet welcoming. Rows of folding chairs, a small stage with a wooden podium, and a fluttering American flag in the corner. Chief Dalton stood near the front, speaking quietly with a couple of local officials. As Buck approached, he spotted Ranger, a newly revived, bright-eyed Labrador, sitting proudly at the chief's side, tail wagging. The dog's ears perked at Buck's arrival, and he let out a low, happy huff. Buck's chest tightened with gratitude he found impossible to articulate. He gently patted Ranger's head, murmuring, "Look at you, all set for the big day, huh?" Ranger responded with a soft lick to Buck's hand, a silent affirmation of the bond that had formed between them since that fateful night. Chief Dalton turned, a warm smile touching his features. "Glad you made it," he said, offering Buck a firm handshake. "We'll keep this short. Just a few words from the mayor, then I'll present certificates for volunteer service." He paused, lowering his voice. "You all right with stepping on stage when I call your name?" Buck swallowed. Public stages weren't his strong suit. "I'll manage," he replied quietly. The memory of how he once dreaded any crowd flickered in his mind. But now, with Ranger leaning trustfully against his leg, the fear softened into something like resolve. People found their seats, the murmurs drifting into a hush as the mayor, a cheerful older woman, stepped to the podium. She spoke of Pine Creek's sense of community, how small acts of courage and kindness wove the town together like threads in a tapestry. Buck shifted in his seat, half listening, scanning the crowd. He recognized a few faces. The younger officer who once glared at him now sat in uniform, giving him a nod of encouragement. The waitress from the diner was there too, smiling. Then Chief Dalton took the stage, clearing his throat. "Today, we honor those who stepped up to help, especially in volunteer rescue efforts," he began. "But we also want to highlight a particular story about a man who lived outside our usual circles, yet helped save lives when it mattered most. And in doing so, discovered a new bond with our department." At that, Ranger padded up to Dalton's side, tail wagging. The chief's eyes flicked toward Buck. "William Buck Marshall, could you join me here?" Dalton's voice carried a kindness that Buck had rarely heard directed at him. A wave of tension gripped Buck. He stood slowly, hearing polite applause ripple through the audience. Eyes pinned on him, yet he forced his legs to move. Ranger bounded off the stage steps, trotting beside Buck as if to guide him. Together, they stood before the podium. Dalton offered him a small plaque. "For your invaluable assistance in search and rescue, and for the personal growth you've shown, overcoming a near tragedy with my K9 to become one of our community's trusted allies. Thank you, Buck." A hush fell, and for a moment, Buck forgot to breathe. He stared down at the plaque, reading his name etched in neat letters. Applause swelled, scattering his anxious thoughts. The crowd's faces beamed, some with mild tears, others with broad grins. And in front of them, Ranger sat, gazing at Buck with that unwavering canine devotion, as if to say, "We did this together." Buck lifted his head, eyes burning. He managed two words that captured everything swirling in him. "Thank you." The applause crescendoed, and he felt it resonate deep in his chest. Against all odds, they'd come to accept him, an old hunter who once nearly pulled the trigger on their beloved K9. Now he stood not as a culprit, but as a partner in forging a safer Pine Creek. As the applause ebbed, Dalton offered a handshake that turned into a quick, supportive clasp on Buck's shoulder. Then he motioned for the audience to quiet, continuing with other awards. Buck stepped off the stage, heart thrumming. Ranger followed, pressing close, tail wagging. In that charged moment, everything felt right. The suspicion and fear that once defined Buck's existence had melted into a new chapter of respect, camaraderie, and the unwavering friendship of a dog who'd taught him more than any human words ever could. And in that quiet, triumphant hush, the town's acceptance bound them all together, man, dog, and community, proving that even the darkest mistakes can lead to a light-filled redemption. Sunset drew a gentle hush over Pine Creek by the time Buck and Ranger left the town hall. The ceremony's applause still rang in Buck's ears, a steady echo of acceptance he never imagined receiving. Ranger padded proudly at his side, tail swaying with each step, as though the dog understood the significance of this new, shared chapter. They paused beside Buck's old pickup. He reached down, ruffling the Labrador's ears, heart full of a gratitude that welled up from the raw memory of that near-fatal shot back at the cabin. So much had changed since then, from mutual fear to unshakable trust, from isolation to a growing sense of community. Today had sealed it in a way words couldn't express. A quiet voice pulled them from the moment. Chief Dalton approached, hat in hand, casual in the evening light. "Good ceremony, huh?" he said, eyes flicking warmly to Ranger before meeting Buck's gaze. "You deserve every bit of that applause." Buck shifted, still unaccustomed to praise. "Never thought I'd be the type to stand in front of a crowd." Dalton half smiled, glancing toward the last rays of sunlight stretching across Pine Creek's main street. Neither did I, but we can't always predict where a single choice might lead us. He patted Ranger's flank, or how a single dog can change so many lives. Ranger sniffed at a passing breeze, as if acknowledging his own pivotal role. Buck chuckled softly. He sure changed mine. And, well, maybe I changed his too. Dalton nodded, silent understanding passing between them. The chief offered a handshake, then stepped back with a small salute. I'll see you around, Buck. Don't be a stranger. We have more rescue trainings next month and Ranger will want to see you. Watching the chief walk away, Buck felt a surge of calm solidarity. His eyes dropped to Ranger, who seemed equally at ease with the day's events. All right, boy, he murmured, opening the passenger door. Time for us to head home. Ranger hopped inside, settling onto the blanket that had become his spot during their rides. Buck eased into the driver's seat, the engine rumbling to life. As they pulled away from the town hall, he noticed the curious stares of a few remaining townspeople, this time filled with warmth rather than suspicion. The road back to his cabin wound through familiar pines, moonlight peeking through swaying branches. Buck drove slowly, letting his mind drift over the day's highlights. That surge of applause, the handshake from the mayor, the soft words from people grateful for his volunteer work. He never wanted acclaim, yet it felt like validation he'd unconsciously craved for so long. Halfway up the mountain, he parked at a scenic overlook, one of his secret spots where the forest spread below in rolling waves of dark green. The sky overhead glittered with the first stars. Buck cut the engine, stepping out to breathe the cool air. Ranger followed, nails clicking on the rocky ground. Together, they stood at the edge, gazing over the valley. Tiny lights from Pine Creek glowed in the distance. Buck felt the night breeze brush his face, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and damp earth. For once, he didn't feel alone. The memories of mockery, isolation, and near tragedy melted into the quiet acceptance of what had become, a life anchored by new connections, tempered by humility, and guided by a dog who had once been at the wrong end of his gun barrel. Kneeling, Buck rested a hand on Ranger's broad back. I guess we found each other, huh? He whispered. The dog leaned into him, eyes half closed, as though in silent agreement. No further words needed, just the rustle of trees and the murmur of forest night creatures. Before heading home, Buck closed his eyes briefly. A sense of closure washed over him, yet it also felt like a beginning. The mountains still loomed, his cabin still stood in solitude, but now he carried the town's acceptance, the chief's trust, and Ranger's unwavering loyalty. That was more than enough. If this story touched you, if you believe in redemption, second chances, and the power a single moment can have, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. Leave a comment below. Has an unlikely bond ever changed your life's course?